Hello, hello. It's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to have you, Valerie. We'll tell people how we know each other. We're probably some of the original residents of the Writers' Room, which was a refuge for writers in Manhattan. And Valerie was one of the first people who actually read my entire novel and loved it. And so you have a very important place in my heart.
Likewise, I'm sure, Cheryl.
And I underline what Alice McDermott said. I mean, these stories are magnificent. They're beautifully crafted. They're inspiring and disturbing, and also very original and very real. And we can talk about that after you read from one of them. So which one are you going to read from, and let us know what it's about?
I'm going to read from Company, and this is a story told by a woman who began as a painter and has become a video artist. And the book is dedicated to two fabulous women, the painter Lillian Bear and the filmmaker Lynn. Sorry, I just saw Lynn Godmillo there. Jill Godmillo, my dear friend Jill, whom I just call by her sister's name. So it's in their honor that I read the opening to this story, Company. When Lily calls to say I should come talk some sense into Diego before he ends up destroying himself, I remind her that I've made a point of avoiding that sweet cheater for years and years now. He seems to have managed just fine. Fine? He's been on hunger strike since this last surgery. What surgery? She rolls it out as if it's old news. Last week, after all those years of diabetes, they amputated again. I don't know about any diabetes, much less years of it. I don't know about any amputation. Vertigo sweeps me up. Lily says that the surgeon is waiting to see whether the right foot will have to go too, so I stop listening entirely. While the world somersaults, I catch sight of a skinny leg hacked off mid-thigh. I see ribbons of bloody flesh and hear Diego, flaneur, lover of women, cockadoodler, howl. Once upon a middle-aged time reader, Diego O'Dowd and I lived together in an artists co-op I'd founded back in the days when artists in downtown Manhattan bought decrepit lofts, unsafe at any price, with money they begged from respectable relatives. By the time Diego moved in, I was 40, Diego 50, our marginal existences long established. My proper Southern mother had almost resigned herself to my unmarried, childless state, though I'm pretty sure she never resigned herself to Diego. We painted at opposite ends of the same studio where we slept, breathing in the toxic fumes of our art, and consoled each other about our rescinded charge cards, our adjunct teaching gigs, our dwindling shows. We ranted together about the torture regime Diego once fled. I even made a little film about his uninsured adventures in emergency rooms. We danced tangos, Diego counting time to keep me in step. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, he returned triumphant from a night of bar hopping and stood at the refrigerator door considering the sparse pickings. In the light of our antique icebox, his belly hung loose and easy, his skin darkening with the wine he downed and the moles that sprouted like mushrooms as he aged before my eyes. His appetite was insatiable, and so was mine. Why, reader, did his flaccid arms and skinny legs make me so tender? Why did I crave his touch? Other artists had moved on to video, to text, to performance. But Diego, who wasn't faithful to much, was faithful to paint. His colors were sublime. His subjects were women, nudes who morphed into fruits and vegetables, surreal mangoes and artichokes in neon colors of such pure intensity that I prickled in their presence. He bragged, he bellowed, he fretted about his grown daughter in Buenos Aires, but did he go to see her? No, he put a scratchy LP on the turntable, came to stand over our bed in the small hours of the morning, and held his hand out. Just one, Maisie, and then we sleep like angels. I'd been sleeping like an angel till he woke me. I rose to dance.
Bravo. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thank
So
you.
one thing, were you ever an actress because you read so well?
Oh, thank you, thank you. I went to New York City at the age of 17, planning to become an actress. And I picked up one copy of Variety and went to one meeting of the theatrical group in college and just thought, oh no, it's too hard a life. So I chose writing instead.
Which is so much easier, as we know.
It's so much easier.
Let's talk a little bit about putting together a story collection. So this is my theory, so you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. I think as writers, especially you've written 6 novels, you have this world called Due East. It's like your Yocapanoca County, which was Beaufort, South Carolina. So it seems to me there are 3 time periods in this collection. There's things that are set in Due East in the narrative childhood. And it is called Due East as opposed to Beaufort, South Carolina. Then there's Park Slope, New York in the 80s, which you read from wonderfully right now. And then it seems to me that moving to Indiana in the Midwest made you start writing post-apocalyptic fiction because you couldn't really deal with having been in the Midwest. There's one line that I'll read from one of the stories in that group, and you say, I know everybody and his Hollywood uncle is selling a post-apocalyptic tale, but I'd like to point out that I haven't mentioned the apocalypse once, and I haven't put in zombies either, though if you're looking for zombies, I'm here to tell you that they're living in the gated burbs of the once Great Plains. So that's my theory. So that is sort of the worlds that you inhabit, and they overlap. And they profoundly influence one another.
It's a pretty good theory, Cheryl. I'll sign on to that theory. The reason I started writing fiction about the future is the reason I start anything, which is something presents itself to me and I say, oh no, I don't want to write that. And that is the sign that I'm doomed, that I'm gonna have to. It's just gonna get to me. It's gonna eat at me. So at the time, as you know, as we all know, everybody, all these literary writers had started to write futuristic fiction. And, there I was, the last sheep crossing the Brooklyn Bridge as I retreated from Manhattan. Story of my life. I said I wasn't going to do it. I said I wasn't going to do it. And then I'm doing it. Right now, I'm writing a memoir, which is a genre that I have been extremely contemptuous of all my life. So, of course, inevitably, that's what I'm doing now.
One of the things that I think is really interesting and about your work, and I think it's really worth to look at in terms of craft, is now you have, I forgot what it's called. You have this genre that is like not fiction and it's not memoir and it's not autobiography. It's like Ben Lerner. To me, that's the person who represents it most and does it the best. So they become the characters in their own story. And you're obviously in all of these stories, but you're not. And you've chosen to write fiction your whole life, and you do it so well with such craft. And I think it's really hard. People don't even realize it. It's like a great car. You don't see all the things putting it together. I've been watching lots of car programs with my husband in lockdown, so that's the reason for the metaphor. So I think, why is fiction so much easier for you, and why has it been the way that you've chosen to tell your stories?
Oh God, fiction is so difficult for me. I cannot begin to tell you. Nobody bellyaches like a writer. And so let me bellyache a little. I find it utterly miserable I dread it. The only way I get through it is to sit down first thing in the morning. I go for a long walk, and then I just strap myself in. And basically, I spend the whole time I have allotted for it, however much time that is, cheating one way or another. You know, getting out my phone when I'm not supposed to, just, making the 12th cup of coffee. However it is I can cheat, I cheat. But somehow if you manage a couple of 100 words a day, they pile up. And then when you see their shit, you just start. Yeah.
So are a lot of the stories, were they excerpted from your larger works, and then did you put them away and resurrect them as stories?
No. There are a few that began in the opposite way. That is, I thought of the stories, and they stuck with me, and I ended up writing more. But I think a story is so very different from a novel. In the same, novels take me forever. They take me far too long, especially now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it's really hard to keep up the intensity that's required for a novel. But a story comes in a kind of burst. A story comes over me. I used to write a poem a year. Now I write a story a year. So these stories were actually composed over a long stretch of time. I ended up writing stories because I couldn't write stories, because when I went to Columbia and took my MFA in writing, I was writing stories, and they were god awful. They were just really shameful.
Did they humiliate you like they humiliated us at Iowa, or were they nice?
Oh, no, nobody was nice in those days. Nobody was nice. And nobody gave serious criticism. We read the stories aloud, and then people responded instantly. And so, there was no thought about it, no time to reflect about it. It was just all, as you say, an exercise in humiliation.
Well, if they were quiet, you knew that you got them. But if they were snickering or starting to doodle, you knew that there was a problem.
Horrible days.
And on that blue, mimeograph paper, right?
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
So tell us how this book, I'm very interested in that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the pandemic. So how did this collection come about? Why this press that I've never heard of?
Well, so I've actually, for years, I haven't thought I've had a collection because of the way I've written stories, because I write, one, maybe two a year, really. I do wait for the spirit to move me. And so, it really didn't seem to me that I had a collection of stories together until a couple of years ago. I started to notice, there's an awful lot of these stories about infidelity, and infidelity in the broadest sense of that term. But I think probably sexual infidelity is the least interesting of the possibilities that the term covers. But we live in such a time of lack of faith in anything, in our friends, certainly in our institutions. A lot of people call our time a post-religious age. There's so much sense that it's very, very hard to have faith in anything. So, I've been exploring that for quite some time. And my friend Greg Wolf, who for many years was the editor of Image magazine, started this press and asked me what I had. And I figured I had a collection of stories.
And it's really, really beautiful. The title story is really like a novel. It's really profound, and it's heartbreaking and really beautiful. And it's set in the South, which brings me another question. In this time of Black Lives Matter, you're a white Southern writer. who grew up, under the cloud of Truman Capote, Harper Lee, and the now sort of reimagined Flannery O'Connor. It was like, I remember when I started to teach, people didn't know about Flannery O'Connor. Now they know about it, and she's really being, characterized as a racist. So do you think that you'll be pigeonholed? Because I don't. I think that your depiction of growing up in the South, especially this one story about an interracial relationship that was told in the third person, really has tremendous relevance. And then I think that somehow we as older writers or as white writers might be getting pigeonholed or told to be that irrelevant, but we're so relevant.
Well,
it's a complex question.
I guess I don't worry so much about being pigeonholed. It's a relief to be talked about in any sense. I also feel as a white writer that I can use instruction. I kind of really welcome this moment. I think it's always been hard to write about race. I tell my students at Notre Dame that that we are more anxious in our classroom to talk about race than we are to talk about anything else, including sex, which at Notre Dame is saying a great deal. So I think it's a wonderful moment in the sense that we are all finally questioning, who should be writing what stories are we entitled to tell, and in what form, and who's not necessarily who's allowed to tell this story, but who's the best person to tell this story, who's the best source of this story. And I've often floundered in writing about race, which is so central to my upbringing. My students can't believe, even though they can see exactly how old I am, that I grew up almost entirely in the days of Jim Crow.
Right.
It was not until high school that I was in any integrated classes whatsoever. I think that if Jim Crow scarred African American people, and it certainly did, it warped white people.
Right.
And there's a lot there to write about. I think my own position is primarily, well, I can write about it from a white perspective because that's what I know. But it becomes very complicated as our worlds and our families become very complicated. I mean, I don't live in thank God, I don't live in a Jim Crow society anymore. And my family's not all one race. So experience is multi-layered and comes from multiple cultures. But I think this is a fantastic moment for literature, for art, for the possibility that we will finally begin to reconstruct our ideas about what kind of culture we want to be. I think Joe Biden said that today when he introduced Kamala Harris. But I definitely feel that that this is a time, that we just have to seize, and writers too. We just have to seize it. And I don't think white writers should ever back down from writing about race, nor do I think they should be so nervous about taking criticism for how they do it. We got a lot to learn.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot to learn. What are your students like? Are they very Midwestern, or do they come from all over the country? Or
they come from all over the country and all over the world, increasingly all over the world, because very often it's those international students who can pay the full freight.
Exactly.
They're fantastic students. They're lovely. I meet them in the I always say this. I meet them in the classroom at the start of every semester, and most of them, it looks like a Sayers family reunion. They're they're blondes and redheads, they're freckled, they have their baseball caps turned backwards, and I go, oh God, another semester. And by the end of the semester, I'm in love with them all. They're fantastic. They're the kind of students who, you know, if you say, "Oh, you should read Zadie Smith," they come back a week later having read all of Zadie Smith.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. That's absolutely great. So I was going to, and you also were raised in a family of faith.
Yeah.
And there's a big, you know, Catholic influence. And another thing is there's religious diversity in your work. I think a lot of people that I tell, there's a very strong Jewish presence in the South. And there is in one of these stories as well. And that itself caused a lot of, I don't know, division or uniqueness of experience.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think, I mean, my mother always said when we were growing up that the Klan was out to get Catholics and Jews as well as Black people, because, you know, white people, it's always all about us. But
right.
But certainly, I think there was a kind of solidarity and awareness that that we stood outside of mainstream Protestant culture. And, you know, that we tended perhaps to be more liberal politically and, you know, less fundamentalist in the way we approached religion, perhaps, in some cases.
When did your family go to the South? Where did they come from?
My family came from New York. My parents were both born in Connecticut, but spent their youth and young adulthood in New York. And they moved down with 3 kids ultimately. And I am the 4th child, so the first born in the South. And
did they go for work, or did they just want to get out of Manhattan, or?
It's funny. Yeah, it's funny. No, my dad was stationed down there. He was a psychologist, and he was stationed down there in the Navy. It came back a couple of years later to take the civilian version of his job. But, you know, then as now, New York was expensive and the family was growing, and it's hard to be in New York. I have to say, they spent my entire childhood pining
for New York. Would they take you to go to the theater and museums? Would you go for pilgrimages back to New York?
We'd go for as long as we could afford, which wasn't long. We had 7 children in the family. My mother once hawked her engagement ring in order to stay a few more days. And that's New York, you know.
Well, there's one beautiful story about going to, about the child being born with 2 sets of teeth. So this very big family has to go to Charleston to see a big surgeon, and to make her look not like a freak is going to probably cost them meals, you know. But there is such love and joy about being in that city. And you could see it and feel it in the family and the parents in the way you describe it, and how it was so appreciated.
Getting out of town. Yeah.
Exactly, to get out of town. Another thing I felt reading your book, you know, there's a lot of young ones in their 20s who are writing about New York in the 80s. And having lived in New York in the 80s and the 90s, it doesn't feel true. It feels like almost a nostalgic imagination. Yours does not. You know, you talk about, and what's interesting is that it feels like that now. You know, I went back to work in the bookstore, and there's a lot of stores that are boarded up. It's a little dangerous. You know, there's been sort of an uptick in crime. You don't feel so safe walking down the streets. And, you know, the stories where you're told about coming to Park Slope with a young family and having to walk up 5 flights of stairs and being nervous about who was coming behind you, that seems so much the time of the past, but it's coming back. So it has a real relevance. You know, and some of it's not bad because there are artists all over the place, you know, and the artists have fled because they couldn't afford it. So maybe, as Laurie Anderson says, maybe the developers are leaving, the artists will start to come back.
I'm ready. I'm ready to come back.
So what are your students reading?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Even the most literary of them, and I started that out funny. It sounds very snooty the way I started that. The most literary of them are reading futurist and fantasy. That's just part of their childhood. Something that
Because of Harry Potter? Or do you think are they reading Octavia Butler? Or are they reading Isaac Asimov? Who are they reading?
They're reading all those old greats that you and I would know about, and a whole lot of people I don't know about.
So do they come to class and then school you on what you don't know?
Yeah, it's a kind of beautiful exchange of knowledge. I actually taught a course. We had decided within the creative writing program that we were going to teach some theme courses, and I volunteered to teach one called Writing the Future, because I had just written one single story about the future, and I thought, well, I should really know about this if I'm going to try to write this way. And so, I teach a course when I want to find something out, and it was a lot of fun. But I focused on all the literary people who were writing fiction about the future, the Colson Whitehead and Zadie Smith and Junot Diaz at the time had just published his futurist piece in the New Yorker. This was the time before people got in big trouble with Me Too. So
yeah.
It was a longer list.
A longer list of who you can't or who you
right,
can.
Right. But Margaret Atwood, we read the first of the Matt Adam trilogy, which is so marvelous. And that stuff was beautiful and delicious to me and opened up a whole new world. But they had a whole other set of references which meant nothing to me, and I'm ashamed to admit that I haven't really pursued that world.
But every generation has its own touchstones.
That's right.
And I wanted to ask how the pandemic has affected you as a writer and as a teacher. You're in Indiana. I don't know what it's like. Are people wearing masks in Indiana? Are they, this is Mike Pence country. So, and you're at is it the biggest Catholic university, or it's the most prestigious?
It's certainly the best known. I will accept best known for Notre Dame, and I'm sure that Notre Dame would say it's the most prestigious, although others may vie for that. So Indiana first. Indiana is the strangest planet I've ever been on. In South Carolina, when I was growing up, people were very fake, and polite, and always pleasant, but you all knew where you stood. And when I got to New York, everybody was very short and told you what you needed to know, and you didn't want to mess around in the checkout line because people had things to do, and let's get going. And so it just took us the longest time to adjust to Indiana at all. And I'm still not adjusted to the Indiana response. I mean, it's all over the country, but certainly there's quite a lot out here of, I don't want to wear a mask, blah, blah, blah. But on campus, supposedly, we're all wearing masks. I am actually out of the Notre Dame classroom this semester. My only teaching assignment this semester is at a prison, and the prison's on lockdown. And so I'm going to be in this very bizarre, talk about another planet. I'll be videotaping myself, and the way I teach is completely Socratic. I don't know any other way. I have a conversation with my students. So I'm going to be asking the questions, and then I'm going to be answering the questions. And it's
You haven't done this before. Is this the first time you'll be teaching in a prison?
No, I have done it before. The most wonderful thing about being in a prison is getting to know the men. And what better way to get to know a group of men than, reading great books with them and reading their writing and getting to know them through their writing. Man, it's just really a revelation. It's so moving, and it's just some of the most satisfying teaching I've ever done in my life. So this idea that that instead of are all sitting around together at a table, I'm going to tape myself. Then that tape will get burned onto a CD, which will be brought to the prison gates.
Wow.
For the men to put, they have no internet access.
Wow.
So we can't do a Zoom class the way we're doing here.
That's commitment to keep it going. That's real commitment.
Well, I need it, I need it. And I think everybody who teaches in the program needs it in a really profound way. I mean, and I think it's a great gift to be connected to people who are struggling. And I mean, these are men who've gone through quite a lot in order to apply to and be accepted in a college program. And most of them will graduate. And
wow. That's amazing. That's very, very, very satisfying.
It sure is.
So how is before we go, well, we have quite a bit of time. How has the pandemic affected you as a writer and as a human being?
As a human being, as the King said, I'm in a state of confusion. I mean, it's people I love have been devastated by it, and that just makes me want to lament and rail, and then I've been given these beautiful stretches of time and reflection, and this chance to do stuff you just never do. My husband Chris and I take this long walk every day reciting these sonnets we're memorizing. It's just a very confusing time in all ways. I think it's there's nothing new in what I'm saying. It's confusing for absolutely everybody. But in terms of writing, it's like it's always hard to write for me, and it just makes it all the harder. It's real hard for me to focus at all, to concentrate, particularly when people you love are sick. It's just impossible to think about anything else.
I agree.
So I'm very forgiving of myself recently.
Well, you have to be.
I usually hold myself to pretty high standards, but not so much these last.
But I just think it's amorphous stress. It's like pain. I think people can tolerate pain if it's going to be over. And nobody knows when this is going to be over. It gets better, it gets worse. I was telling you before, New Zealand had eradicated it and everybody was going to be, why aren't you there? There's 5 new cases and then the whole country's in lockdown again. So there's this sense of nobody knowing, and it penetrates your dreams. I started reading pandemic novels, which was really kind of stupid, at the beginning.
Yeah, that hasn't occurred to me, Cheryl, I must say.
But I've gotten over that. And so now I have a bit of focus, and we're lucky that I was in New Jersey and then I get to go back to New York. So what are you reading? Well,
again, I'm reading very, very, very slowly, but I finally caught up with last year's Booker Prize winner, Girl, Woman, Other, Bernardine Evaristo. I just loved it so much. Just really swept me away. And I'm kind of late. I'm always a little behind. Sometimes a century or more behind. But I also really loved Anna Burns's Milkman.
It was the Booker Prize the year before.
That's right. A theme here. And I'm really hoping to get to, I mentioned Zadie Smith before. She is indeed one of my favorite writers, and I'm hoping to get both to her new little book about this time and her book of short stories, which I haven't read yet.
I'll send it to you. We have it in the store.
Thank you. This is the great advantage of
I'll tell you my great Sadie Smith story is that I was sitting having lunch on Broadway, and I was with these friends of mine who are not writers. And she was sitting with her husband and her children, and they thought she was an actress because she's so stunningly beautiful, and she's so brilliant too. So they were sort of gobsmacked when I said who she was. She is really a force. And speaking for all of us. And how are your sons doing in the Brooklyn of your past?
Well,
Are they in Park Slope, or where are they?
no, they're on either end of Park Slope. I hope they don't mind my talking about them. But
You
yeah,
don't have to mention their names.
they are on either end. One is in Burham Hill and one's in Kensington. And I think they're just city boys, you know. But they were born in Brooklyn, and in Brooklyn they will stay.
So the name of my series is Between Two Worlds, and you live between many worlds. What is home to you?
Yeah. Well, I long for New York, and I long for South Carolina, and there's a third point on that triangle. This summer I have been longing for Ireland. I've been teaching in Ireland the last several summers, and I just couldn't believe I didn't get to go this summer, even though it's it's a whole lot of work and it's exhausting. And I always think, why did I agree to do this? But it is a place which really feels like home to me, and it's very strange to have that kind of cultural memory. The first time I went to Ireland, we went to a swimming pool, and I had grown up all my life in South Carolina with people saying, "Oh, ew, why are you so white? Why don't you get a tan?" And here I was in this swimming pool in Ireland, thinking, "My people, here they are." But also the food. The food was pretty bad back in the day, and that seemed familiar too.
What part of Ireland were you teaching in?
Well, we start a week in Dublin, and then we move out west to Kylemore Abbey, which is in Connemara. And yeah, my family comes from the west of Ireland, from County Kerry, which is also just, it's only the most beautiful place on the planet. But I think you probably have some rival spots in New Zealand to talk about.
Well, I was like a Samoan princess in New Zealand, because a New York Jewish girl who speaks her mind in a pretty conservative society. It's very much, people say that New Zealand is like England in the 50s. In some ways it is. I mean, there's this really profoundly strong, beautiful Maori culture. And also there's so many Asians in New Zealand. So it's really like one of the most diverse countries in the world, but it still has this reticence. So you come as a New Yorker and you go in a room and there's a bad smell and everyone is looking for it, but nobody's saying anything. So you're the one that says something, and there's like a grasp of people breathing like, oh my God, I'm so happy somebody said that. But New Zealand is profoundly gorgeous. And the one thing I miss more than anything is the bird song. I'm not a bird person. I saw the birds, the Hitchcock film when I was a kid. I was terrified of birds, but I love the birds in New Zealand. And they would wake me up and sing symphonies in the morning. And it really has become my other home. So, and that's really interesting to me to feel so strongly to one place. Plus my parents were refugees. So, you're torn between all these cultures, and somehow you hope they combine in your work and come to some alchemical result that's only yours.
Right. Well, that's very much how I feel about Ireland. There's just a kind of sense of geographical rightness on top of the cultural rightness to it.
And it's a good time in Ireland now. They're not living in, the war so much. I mean, it's there, but I think it's so much more peaceful. My father-in-law is from Northern Ireland, so I spent a lot of time in Belfast, which is a very different place than Dublin or Connemara.
It sure, yes.
And it sure is.
Absolutely.
But I'll tell you, I don't know, when you grew up, were they filled with mythological stories? There are all these dark stories from.
I always say we were Turalura Irish. We really we didn't have a deep cultural grounding. My grandmother spoke Irish, but
cool.
We certainly didn't. And we read the big book of Irish myths, which by the time it came down to us in the 50s was the big book of Irish leprechauns.
So I'll
So,
ask you one more question, and then I'll ask if there's questions coming from the audience. What would you like to see happen with this lovely book of stories, The Age of Infidelity?
oh, it's already happened, and this is, you know, a night like this is one of the ways, you know, and that is, you know, discerning readers picking it up and reading one or two or three. It takes me sometimes years to read a book of short stories, because each one is a little experience, you know.
That's true. That's really
So,
true.
so it's very, very moving for me to see these faces and to think about, you know, people taking the time to read short stories and savor them, you know, and just be in them for a little minute.
One of the good things about being a bookseller, which I've always loved, is that you get to see what people read. You get to give them advice as to what to read. And in this pandemic, you know, people are really coming to the bookstore so happy to have a destination, really reading. You know, it's kind of a refuge in a way that people really need. So that's actually a positive thing that's come out of this. And with that, I'm going to ask John, are there any questions from the audience that you can pose to lovely Valerie?
There are. To follow up on what you were just saying about Ireland, you said you weren't raised with a tremendous amount of cultural heritage, but how do you think your Irish American heritage as an adult has informed your writing? And I know you've spent a lot of time in Dublin teaching for Notre Dame, etc. Do you think it's made an impact on what you do when you sit down to write?
Oh, I think it's made a tremendous impact. Ireland is such a literary place. I was there with my family, and we could figure out the year, maybe 91 or 92. But you know, Russia was, the Soviet Union was falling. It was, you know, it was anything that was on the international news was about the fall of the Soviet Union. And the headline in the Irish Times was the winner of their literary prize. And I thought,
Wow.
what a country, you know, they've got their priorities absolutely right. You know, but I think that is the being in Ireland is most profound for me, because it makes me realize how rich the daily language of a country can be, you know, when people value just the most common speech. You know, you can be speaking to anybody, and there's slip and sly ones in on you right and left. It's a great joy, and it's a great joy when people have lines of poetry by heart.
Yes. Sure.
And quite embarrassing to bring a room full of Notre Dame students into certain meetings where they are apt to be asked, you know, will you give us a few lines of Yeats? Will you? And you know,
that's true.
there's a panic crossing the faces of all my students, and then of course a panic crossing my own.
That's right.
That I might be called on to rescue them.
Another question from the chat. A cutting question. Valerie, as I'm sure you know, Flannery O'Connor was asked if she thought universities stifle writers, and she responded that she thought they don't stifle enough of them. I wonder, now that you've spent considerable years as a professor, what you think about the balance of teacher and writer.
Oh,
No, it's a tough line.
Yeah. By the way, I always quote that line of Flannery O'Connor in my fiction writing classes, and you know, I laugh a lot longer than my students.
Yeah, that's incredible. I would love the first day of class to hear that.
Right. You know, I think the best thing teachers can do, this is something Grace Paley used to say, is get out of the student's way. I don't know if you were present, Cheryl. There was a wonderful writers' room event at which Grace Paley gave the opening address, and she told a story about how when she was teaching, she would have a student read page 1, page 2, page 3. Somewhere in there, she was going to go there. That's where the story starts.
That's
and I think that kind of minimal intervention to help a student get someplace a little faster, perhaps, to ask the right questions. But I must say, I learned quite a lot from my students. Always. They produce a great deal more than I do, and that's always instructive to me. They're not as fearful as I am about committing thoughts to the page.
Another good question. So much of your early work takes place in Due East, which is modeled so much on a real place. Can you speak about the difference for you between working in a world based on your experience and working on the more imagined worlds of your futurist stories in this collection?
Good question.
Yes, and kind of brings us full around to where the conversation began. When I began, I was heavily under the influence of Faulkner. As a young writer, probably many young writers are heavily under the influence of Faulkner, even these days. But it was really important to me to create a kind of moral universe, with boundaries I could handle. And so I was also a Joyce person. And, I think I wanted to do what he did, which was remember where I came from by reconstructing it street by street. The difference, I suppose, was that I was scared of people in Beaufort finding me out. And so I ended up doing a great deal more obscuring of that town and that place, of that so-called moral universe. I think I'm doing pretty much the same thing these days, even when I'm thinking about a future place. One of the stories that I get a big tickle out of, I'm always surprised about what stories readers like best. One of the ones I like best, and no one has ever said to me, this is my favorite story of yours, but one of the ones I like best is about the old couple living in a garage. And that story began because my husband Chris and I would walk through our neighborhood, and for years I would say, these garages are big enough to house entire families. Why don't we just move some families into these garages? And it was that remark, which I think ultimately makes itself into the story. My lovely colleague, Kate Marshall at Notre Dame, always says, well, futurism is the most realistic of the realisms. And a number of critics agree. And I think it's an astute remark that if you're writing about the future, you are in fact very, very interested in the particulars of this place you create.
True.
And then I think I have one last question. Somebody wants to know what your thoughts are so far about the memoir that you're working on.
My thoughts are, I don't think this memoir is ever going to see the light of day. I think this is an exercise in writing for myself. I'm not entirely sure, and I'm still finding my way very blindly. My friend William O'Rourke always says that writing a novel is like riding down a long highway in the desert with no headlights.
Right.
And so writing a memoir is maybe writing your spaceship or your hearse or something down a long road in the desert with no headlights. I don't know what I'm doing. I am intrigued always by the question of how much of my story impinges on other people's stories. This is my this is my obsession of the moment. What stories ethically am I entitled to tell? But because I grew up in the Jim Crow South, I think this question of how do I write about race is challenging, is crucial, is the hard business of writing. So
Right. We have a few minutes. I just want to have what kind of reaction did you have from your childhood friends, family members of your fiction?
Oh, people in South Carolina are so nice, they're just so nice. So, everybody is always lovely. Everybody is always as lovely as they could be. And whatever thoughts they have that are not lovely, they keep to themselves, or at least wait until I have left the room. So, I've been very blessed in that regard. In New York, people are real blunt. They just, they just tell you what they think, and then you cry.
Exactly. Either in front of them or you go home and cry.
Right. But the South is so much part of me. As I said, I was the first in my family born in the South, but that was tremendously important identity for me. And in so many ways, I'm reconstructing the South that I lived in, but I'm also reconstructing a South I want to live in, because I think that I'm going to go back to Beaufort, South Carolina, and make the rest of my life there.
Oh, and that's interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting, isn't it?
It is. It really is. But that's really beautiful.
Well, we'll have to see how low those New York apartment prices come.
I think they're going to be very low pretty soon.
But Beaufort, South Carolina, in fact, is a beautiful place in multiple ways. And it, there's some ugliness in the culture, but there's such richness in the culture as well. And I think the thing that moved me over and over as our culture moved from Jim Crow days and bitter segregation to our first halting attempts at integration was the graciousness and forgiveness of so many people in the South, so many African American people who endured all the years they endured and continue to endure, the indignities that we white people have heaped upon them. So that was a long way away from
that answer,
the original question.
So I think it's an optimistic day for us.
It is an optimistic
future.
Day.
Yeah. And in our work as writers, in our responsibility as Americans, as children of immigrants, people of faith, believe in humanity and in the power of art, I think. And hopefully things will get better. And we will be able to realize a better world within our lifetime, slowly.
Amen.
Like how you read stories. So I want to thank you so much, and I really encourage all of your friends and all of our viewers to read this wonderful collection of stories, slowly, fast, whichever way you want. Story, put it away. And thank you so much for coming, and come to my next one on August 20th with Nina Schengel, talking about her book, Reservoir Days.
My great pleasure. Thank you, Cheryl.
Much love. I wish I'm hugging you virtually.
The first comment in the chat was how much I love you too. I'm in Valerie Cheryl heaven. So thank the two of you for this celestial conversation. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we'll send you the Zadie Smith, Valerie.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Have a good night.
And I'm finally opening up the chat. It's lovely to see the comments.
Big hug. Have a good night.
Good night.
Take care.